Forward TV. The world is thinking.
The gestation period for my bureaucratic pregnancy lasted 2 years, similar to an elephant, I'm told. It involved 6 months home study with our local authority, in which we were grilled by a social worker for 3 hours every 2 weeks. We were assessed by a panel at the town hall, and our papers proceeded through the Department of Health and then were sent to Beijing to the Chinese government Civil Affairs Department. And there they have a sort of matching room where piles of files about girls who've been abandoned all over the country are matched with another pile of files of prospective parents. And an official there sort of plays God and decides which child goes with which parent. Virtually all the girls up for adoption in China are foundlings. Both of ours were discovered at the steps of 2 orphanages in different parts of China, so we have absolutely no idea of their background. They were simply left in a bundle at the steps of the orphanage. It was expensive. It cost then, with 2 home studies, over £5,000 given to our local authority, as well as 2 donations of $3,000 to each orphanage, not to mention legal and travel expenses. But I would say, overall, we were lucky. We had sympathetic social workers, and basically the procedure worked out. But many have found the process far more arduous, and many others, many others, have given up altogether. When I made a series for Radio 4 last year, we followed various couples, and their success depended to a large degree on a postcode lottery. Some local authorities are ideologically opposed to overseas adoption, and then it becomes almost impossible. My girls, Jade and Rose, are now 8 and 5, and they're wonderful, beautiful, adorable, and often very challenging. Adoption parenting is parenting plus because of the issues that come up because of those early broken attachments. It's not the same as having a biological child, but it's still hugely rewarding, and I'm definitely learning every day. They ask me endlessly about their story, about what happened to them in China, and we discuss it, and we cry over it, and we look at footage from China. And Jade, in fact, a few years ago, she used to reenact being born to me. She pretended to be a little puppy, and she'd crawl through my legs and say, "Mummy, mummy, mummy, pretend I'm a puppy and I've just been born from you." And we used to have this whole little game, which she did over and over again. So we talk a lot about the adoption and how she's come to be my child and all of that kind of thing. So they're very aware of what we know about their background. Now, the fallacies that come up in the press. When I read about overseas adoption, it just doesn't seem to reflect the kind of reality that I experience. Fallacy number 1, overseas adopters are celebrities or rich and are just doing it to circumvent the domestic adoption process. Well, it's true. A few celebrities have adopted from overseas, but only about 5 or 6. Some have given it a bad name. There's the ongoing problem of Madonna. I read the other day that the father of the Malawian boy that she adopted said he wasn't told about her proposed divorce and doesn't want his son being brought up by a single mother. And he says he regrets putting his son up for adoption. That's just the kind of situation you don't want to get into. Yes, a lot of white middle-class people do overseas adoption, but partly because it's expensive. If it was cheaper, yes, it would be open to lots of other people. Most overseas adopters are pretty ordinary people who've thrown all their resources at building or expanding their family. Lots of the debate about overseas adoption is sort of infected with a kind of political correctness. We are seen as white imperialists, rather pernicious, as if we'd gone baby shopping, waving fistfuls of dollars at any passing family in some poor country. I was once accused of being someone, actually this was on Radio 4, of being someone who was going to Kenya to buy split peas. But never has a basket of groceries been so demanding, fulfilling, emotional, and life-changing and expensive as my children. Fallacy number 2, if you stop all those selfish overseas adopters, you'll suddenly solve the problem of children in care. Well, I've just checked with David, and there is at least 60,000 children in care. But every year in Britain, there are only 300 overseas adoptions. That's from everywhere in the world coming into Britain. So even assuming we all just packed up and stopped the whole thing, I don't think it would dent very much those figures of children in care. We wanted to adopt a young child. Yes, I'm sorry, we did. Do we criticise prospective parents wanting to have a baby when they get pregnant? How many other people actually want a small young child when they want to start a family? Now, we were told that our chances of adopting a very young child in the UK were virtually nil. We were a white couple in our early 40s, and we would not be a high priority. Most of the children, the small children coming up for adoption, are of mixed race, and social workers try and match the race of those children to the parents. Now, we didn't want to go through a long home study only to be told at the end that there was no chance of a child, because it all takes ages, and by then, time is ticking by. So we opted for what we felt would give us the best chance of having a family. Overseas adoptions almost never fail, whereas that is once the child is back here, whereas 1 in 5 domestic adoptions fail, each one representing a mountain of emotional pain for both parents and children. So if overseas adoption hadn't been possible, we might not have gone ahead. And in fact, the more I've learned about the impact of early damage to a child from broken attachments and abuse, the more I feel it probably would have been too much for us. Now, that was our choice. Others make different choices, and I very much applaud those who do adopt older children from care. But what I won't accept is censure from ordinary people who don't have adopted children, who say, you should have adopted a child from care. I would say that anybody who has biological children is in fact far, far better qualified than we, a childless couple, to adopt and give that sort of a child the stability they need, especially with all the experience of parenting that would go with it. Fallacy number 3, the child loses all its own culture, grows up feeling rootless and suffering prejudice. This is the post-imperialist guilt argument. Now, we don't take children from happy families steeped in their culture. I didn't see many mooncakes and Chinese New Year celebrations going on in orphanages in China. And I just wonder how much culture really matters in an orphanage. If we hadn't adopted our children, they may have died. And what sort of cultural experience is that? That's not to say domestic adoption isn't preferable. And thanks to the huge amount of international attention and money that's been poured into Chinese orphanages because of overseas adoption, domestic adoption is now on the rise. And foreigners now have to wait at least 4 years to adopt a Chinese child, and I imagine it's going to be phased out, probably in due course. But that's fine, but that would have been too late for our girls. If we'd waited and just not had overseas adoption, they probably would have died. As mortality rates in Chinese orphanages are extremely high, or used to be anyway, before the money from overseas adoption started coming in. And in terms of keeping links to their culture, we do what we can. Chinese friends, myself and the girls are learning Mandarin, we're in touch with Jade's foster family, and we're planning a trip back. But we have allowed Jade to skip her Mandarin lessons. We just didn't want her to sit through one more lesson feeling that she couldn't do it. She has a lot of issues to do with learning, and now she's thrown herself into learning Spanish with some gusto. That's her choice, but I don't know what the PC Brigade would say. But I don't fear for the future of Chinese culture, nor for the opportunities to explore it in the years ahead. The biggest issues I have with Jade, that's the old one, are to do with her day-to-day emotional well-being, her anxiety about school, her dyscalculia, her confidence in lessons, cultural sensitivity that seems to loom so large in the press and elsewhere. Actually, right now, it seems to be the least of our problems, living in a multicultural area in London where even the fact that they don't look like me is hardly noticed in the school, where there are loads of mixed marriages and lots of children don't look like one or other parent. Fallacy number 4. If overseas adoption stopped, we wouldn't have all that nasty corruption in relation to the trade in babies. Well, now, I totally agree it's terrible if rich foreigners come in and are duped by people and end up taking part in any kind of baby trade. But I would argue reform is a lot better way forward than simply closing the doors. The British government's closed the doors to Guatemala and Cambodia recently, but that's not to say there aren't children in Guatemala and Cambodia and other parts of the world that are probably then not going to have a parent. We should always keep the focus on what the best needs of that child is from wherever they are in the world. And that's actually what we sign up to with the Hague Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Okay, thank you. Perfect timing. Thanks. I've just been told the very good news that Emily's book is available and on sale downstairs at the Foyles bookstore. So you can come with me later and get my signed copy. And also to remind me to say that Terry is the joint producer of this session, which I didn't mention, so I do apologise for that. Over to the other joint producer, Dave.
Thank you, Fiona. Despite the Daily Mail's sometimes hysterical coverage of so-called child-snatching social workers, I think it's worth saying that it's increasingly the case that local authorities are very reluctant to take children into care, particularly into residential care, whether on the grounds of cost or out of a recognition of the damage done by the care system itself. In England, as Emily said, there are approximately 60,000 children, thank you, in the care system at any one time. And about 70% of these are actually in foster care. Some will remain in the care system for a number of years. Others will only be accommodated short-term and will return to their families. Though the majority of adopted children have previously been in care, most as a result of parental neglect, some experiencing family breakdown and a few abuse, only a small proportion of these children are in fact adopted. Last year, while just 2,500, or 4% of the care population, were placed for adoption, nearly twice that number were placed with their own parents. I think the place of adoption in British society has changed considerably over the past decades. The liberalising trends that culminated in the legalisation of abortion in 1967 and the fading of the stigma of illegitimacy have had a profound impact. The number of adoptions fell rapidly in the 1970s, and the rate has continued to fall ever since to a fraction of what it used to be. While adoption is increasingly favoured today as the best way of achieving permanence for children in care, this downward trend has continued. However, some children are left rattling around in the care system for longer than others. There are a number of so-called difficult-to-place children waiting to be adopted. These are, as Emily indicated, children who are older, particularly boys, children with disabilities, siblings, and other children with complex problems that make them less attractive to potential adopters. And again, this is sometimes the reason cited that some people go abroad to places like China to adopt children. I think in an understandable attempt to grapple with the confusion and sometimes the guilt that some people associate with adopting overseas, adoptive parents try to protect the cultural heritage of their children for fear that they might lose their sense of identity. I think what makes sense for individual adopters going overseas actually becomes a barrier in the context of the UK. As National Adoption Week starts, which is the week after next, I believe, I think you can expect to see your local adoption agencies launching recruitment campaigns on the back of buses, in local newspapers, holding special community events, all in an attempt to widen the pool of adoptive carers. For me, though, this is driven at least in part by the restrictions imposed by the adoption agencies themselves. The national minimum standards for adoption say that in order to secure and promote their welfare, adoption agencies must ensure that children are matched with adopters who best meet their assessed needs. And those assessed needs must reflect the child's ethnic origin, cultural background, religion, and language. So the matching process is, to put it bluntly, driven by the expectation that white carers are just not appropriate when it comes to adopting black or minority ethnic children. However, though arguably the most controversial aspect of the debate, I think cultural and heritage are only one set of criteria that are used to assess potential carers with regards to their suitability to adopt or indeed foster a child. They also consider the lifestyles of wannabe carers and how these might impact on the welfare of the child. It may no longer be the case that people living on their own or in gay or lesbian relationships are barred from adopting a child, but other categories of people are. Despite the apparently liberalising reforms, the moralising around people's lifestyles and attitudes to child rearing has never been more apparent. Recent newspaper headlines have featured numerous accounts of people denied the opportunity to foster or adopt on the grounds that they are too white, too fat, too posh, or just too fond of smacking their own children to look after somebody else's. But last year, David Holmes actually argued that there are no blanket bans around adoption. I actually have some sympathy for that view. Or I did until last week, that is, when I heard that Redbridge Council actually announced a ban on recruiting foster carers who smoke on the grounds that they have a duty of care to the child, which they seem to forget at other times. But smoking was clearly regarded as more important than abuse or any of the other experiences these children might go through. But I think a zero-tolerance attitude to smoking and to smacking appear to be the new orthodoxies when it comes to protecting children and assessing carers. Recently, a group of MPs tabled an amendment to the Children and Young Persons Bill in an attempt to outlaw smacking. Though they failed, I think that their view that smacking is just common assault or lies somewhere on a continuum of abuse is a widely held view in the liberal establishment, of which the children's social sector is effectively a part. But the notion that everything from smoking or smacking poses a risk to adopted children is a myth. Yes, there may be instances where a child has a particular health condition that would make it unwise to place them in a smoking household, or where their experience of physical abuse would call for sensitive handling by their adoptive carer. But I think these are likely to be the exception, not the rule, and easily negotiated without resorting to what amount to virtual bans, and by denying perfectly good carers the opportunity to look after a child. Are these really the sorts of criteria that adoption agencies should be using when determining whether somebody should be allowed to adopt a child or not? Every good social worker, even some bad ones, will tell you that it's the welfare of the child that is paramount consideration when making a decision about a child. But it seems to me that it's the official distaste for certain lifestyle choices and for certain child-rearing methods and the orthodoxy of protecting children's cultural heritage that are really paramount for the adoption authorities. They're imposing a set of criteria that actively discriminate against both potential adopters and against children themselves, who are needlessly denied a loving home as a result. Surely it's the role of the adoption agency to facilitate the adoption process, not to put hurdles or brick walls in the way of people. I think the adoption process needs to be opened up to a wide-ranging debate, and hopefully we can do that today. We need to return to first principles. For me, the liberalising reforms of the adoption process are not nearly liberal enough. A truly liberal approach to adoption would mean asking searching questions about the kinds of criteria used to decide whether somebody should adopt a child or not. These shouldn't be no different to the kinds of criteria society uses to decide what makes a good parent, or when it is legitimate for the state to remove a child in the first place. It's only by situating the adoption discussion in this wider debate, I think, about the vulnerability of children, about the supposed inadequacy of parents, and about the role of the state in general in family life, that we can begin to improve the experience of all those caught up in the adoption process.
Okay, thanks. John?
Thank you. Everybody on this panel seems to have a long list of things that they regard as prejudices about adoption, and I am no exception to that. I'm going to mention three things that I think are prejudices about adoption, and then just briefly discuss one of them. The first prejudice and fallacy is that race matching is either beneficial or morally required. It's just racism, race matching. I just suggest that to you. I'll be prepared to argue it in a moment. Second fallacy is that young children or babies have a culture or even a nationality. What nonsense. What they may have, we may hope that they have, is a right of abode in a particular country. But to suggest that babies or very young children possess a culture or a nationality seems to me absurd. But I'm not going to discuss those. I'm going to discuss the third prejudice, and that is that it is right or morally responsible to assess prospective parents or indeed match them. Dave has just questioned some of the criteria standardly used for assessing the adequacy of prospective parents. I'm going to go the whole hog and say we should use no criteria. There are no criteria. So that is my brief, and I've got, I think, about 4 minutes left to speak to. When we assess prospective parents in what I regard as a vain attempt to test their fitness for the role, whether in adoption or in access to assisted reproductive technologies, it seems to me that we do a double wrong. We discriminate against people who may be having difficulty in founding a family, thereby adding insult to injury, and we violate what I think is a fundamental principle of democracy, which I should call the democratic presumption. A quick word about the democratic presumption. It is that in a liberal democracy like ours, like any of the ones that we're talking about, there is a basic presumption, and that is that the freedom of citizens should not be interfered with unless good and sufficient justification can be shown for so doing. The presumption must be that citizens should be free to make their own choices in the light of their own values, whether or not these choices and values are acceptable to the majority. Only serious, real and present danger, either to other citizens or to society, is sufficient to rebut this presumption. If anything less than this high standard is accepted, then liberty is dead. That's the general statement. Now, how does that apply to adoption? Well, it applies in this way. I'm going to state again as a challenge, there are no prospective tests for adequate or even minimally decent parenting. Since there are no such tests, child protection cannot require them, because there is no rational way of knowing in advance of somebody mistreating a child that they are more likely than others to do so. I'll come back to that right at the end. Moreover, and this is the really important point it seems to me, if we had any confidence at all in any prospective criteria for adequate parenting, then we would be wrong to apply them simply in marginal cases, like adoption, fostering, or assisted reproduction. That is the tip of the iceberg in terms of creating children. If we thought we had good prospective tests for parental adequacy, then we would apply them first and foremost to sexual reproduction and protect those kids, the majority of kids that get into the world and are placed with families. But we don't. We let any Thomasina, Dorothy, or Harriet go out and acquire children through sexual reproduction. If we are serious, as I say, we should apply the criteria that we have to all parents. And it's not that we couldn't. We could license parents. It would be a political bombshell and probably very unpopular, but we could do it. And if we thought child protection required it, then obviously we should do it. But actually, we all know that there are no ways of screening parents for their adequacy, and that's why we don't do it. That's why we don't license parents. So why should we go through the charade of matching and screening would-be adopters or candidates for IVF? That seems to me to be a charade and indeed contrary to the democratic presumption. We don't need adoption agencies, as I say, because they have no knowledge that can be applied to child protection. We already remove children from the custody of parents who have palpably ill-treated or placed them in danger. And we will, I hope, continue to do that. So nothing that I am saying precludes the introduction of clear disqualifications from parenting, whether through sexual reproduction, adoption, fostering, or assisted reproductive technologies. The candidates for exclusion might be, I'll leave this to further discussion, convicted paedophiles, serial child abusers, those with a proven history of recklessly abandoning children, among many others. These could be precluded from parenting. But this does not mean that in the absence of such proven inadequacy of parents, we have any way of predictably deciding whether a particular candidate for parenting is likely to be one of those people, or indeed any disqualify themselves in any other way. It's a waste of time, it's a waste of money. We shouldn't do it. If people want to use adoption agencies, fine, let them go on using them. If that is a good way of matching children to parents, but it seems to me what we've heard about today already in matching children to parents is pretty haphazard, despite all of the absurd and humiliating, as I would see it, lengths that we go to in scrutinizing parents. There are no proven dangers that justify that. Therefore, we should abandon it. Thank you very much.
Very provocative. Thank you, John, as ever. Terry, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, everybody. I come here as a practitioner. I work in the adoption team of a local authority, but I am here in a personal capacity. I'm a bit reminded at the moment, having this stage of the proceedings, of the 4th century Bishop Donatus, who said, "Cursed be those who make our remarks before us." So I hope it's not going to be too boring. I'm going to talk about 4 points, some of which have been raised publicly as matters of concern. The issues I'm going to raise are as follows. Firstly, is there a tendency for children to be removed too quickly from their birth parents and placed for adoption, possibly in order to meet the government's targets and without really having given birth parents a chance? Secondly, is the process to become an adopter too intrusive and drawn out, and does it unnecessarily exclude some people? Thirdly, why are there still so many children waiting for adoptive families, in particular the older children, those over 5 years old? And fourthly, the issue of same-race placements, which has already been alluded to. It's currently almost impossible to place children in families of a different ethnicity. So to the first point, are children removed too quickly from their birth parents? What's the evidence? I will leave the statistics to the two Davids, which I'm sure they'll be able to supply us with later, except to say that for some years the Labour government has supported adoption as a means of achieving permanence for children, which I support because permanence for children is so very necessary. It's also brought in some frameworks for care planning, which have also been very helpful. When a referral is made about a family where a child or children may be at risk, contrary to what people may think, every effort is made to enable the child to remain with their birth family, as it's universally acknowledged as being the best place for the child to be. Substantial efforts are made to offer practical help and support to the family. However, a balance has to be made between enabling disadvantaged parents to care adequately for their child and yet not compromise on meeting the basic needs of the child. This is a very difficult balance to achieve, and I'm sure you'll all be aware of scandals and things that hit the headlines where, in one way or another, that balance has failed. The removal of a child from their family is rightly a very carefully considered process, but I'm afraid we have to recognise children can't wait to be parented and cared for, and their interests have to be paramount, not just because social workers think so, but because it's actually part of the regulations and legal framework within which we work. The child's needs have to take precedence. The state has a primary duty to protect. My answer to the question, therefore, are they whisked away too soon, is a very definite no. In fact, quite the reverse. I and many social workers would say children are often left for far too long and at great cost to their immediate and long-term well-being, health and development. They need to be removed earlier, in my view. There's been a huge amount of research about children's emotional health, and we know that in order to grow and develop properly in every respect, physically, intellectually, socially and emotionally, they need secure bonds with and consistent care from a small number of caregiving adults. And this is usually referred to as the attachment process. Currently, many children in care needing adoption are described as globally developmentally delayed. That is, they are delayed in every aspect of their development because they have not experienced the necessary attachments, and many, as I've already said, have also been subject to varying degrees of abuse and neglect. And these children, therefore, have behaviour difficulties and anxieties, learning difficulties and problems in relationships. Children who've been damaged in this way are therefore less attractive to adopters because they are more difficult to manage, at least in the short term. There are significant uncertainties as to future developmental process, and sometimes when damage has been in utero, medically too, the long-term prognosis is unknown. Now, the second point. Is the process of approval as an adopter too intrusive? The question I would like to ask is, intrusive for whom? Is it, for example, too intrusive for the children? As I've just mentioned, these are children whose needs have not been adequately met and who are suffering the consequences. It's therefore imperative that any system for trying to find substitute families for them is reasonably effective in trying to ensure, and no system is ever going to be 100%, that their needs will be met and understood, and that they will be safe. It must be acknowledged that parenting these children is, and can feel for adopters, very different from parenting children who've experienced good care and secure attachments. Is the process therefore too intrusive for the applicants? All social workers in adoption have to work from the perspective of finding families for the children that we actually have here and now, not finding children for families who come to us. And clearly there has to be a duty of care to anyone contemplating parenting children who have such considerable needs. Some of the issues that need to be discussed with them, as well as the practical things like smoking, etc., the more important substantial issues are what expectations do they have in relation to their children and to parenting, and can they accept all the uncertainties that go with every aspect of adoption? Can they accept, for example, the fact that the adopted child's birth family will be a fact of the adopter's own lives for as long as the child is, forever? And can they cope with contact, which nowadays is often direct, with other people in the child's life, in particular other siblings who may be adopted elsewhere. The third issue I want to raise is the issue of the placement of older children, which has already been touched on. Nowadays, most adopters want very young children because they think there will be fewer problems, although this is not always the case. It's very difficult to place children over 5 years old. That's what we mean by older children. We're not talking here about teenagers. We're talking about children over 5 years old. I've been searching for a year for a family for a child of 7. There are more boys in the care system than girls, and more people want girls than boys. Boys often express their feelings aggressively, even when they are small, and this frightens adopters. Finally, I want to raise the issue, which has again already been mentioned, of ethnicity and race. I know this is controversial, and no doubt many of my colleagues, and possibly David as well, will also take issue with me. But I also know, because of discussions I've had over many years, that I'm not alone in holding these views. Currently, it's heresy within the family placement field to even think of placing children in permanent placements which are of a different ethnicity to that of the child. Most children's social workers, especially in the bigger cities, refuse point blank to even consider unorthodox placements. I know because I've tried many, many times. Many of the children needing placements are of a different ethnicity to the majority of the population, and many linger too long in the care system because of an ethnic racial match is difficult to find. Meanwhile, there are many families, I could take you to several now, who are waiting for children. It's not a straightforward issue, but as this is the battle of ideas and free speech is allowed, we are all human beings and capable of responding to each other as such. Culture is secondary. The priority is that the central needs of the children for love, care, security, etc., which despite everything can still be met within a family, of which there are, thank goodness, many different kinds. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and you have to keep time because everyone else has. So fine.
Thank you very much. I want to start by just talking to you about modern adoption, about adoption today in 2008, because I'm not sure that we all share the same understanding about what adoption is like now. I think we often think about adoption perhaps as it was in the 1950s and the 1960s, where 27,000 children a year were adopted domestically at its peak. And if you wanted a child, then the child was most likely to be the child perhaps of a single woman who'd got pregnant outside marriage and had been forced because of societal pressure to give that child up for adoption. And maybe the adoption would be arranged through your local GP. And there wouldn't be lots of bureaucratic paperwork to be filled in. And it would be very much about the adoption of very small babies. Adoption in 2008 is very different. For a start, last year, 2007-8, 3,200 children were adopted from care. Dave used the figure of 2,500 placements, but 3,200 adoption orders were made. So if you think about it, if you think about the number of children in care, about 1 in 20 children will be adopted. Now, I'm not going to say that adoption is anything other than the most radical intervention that the state could possibly make in a family's life. Because what adoption means is cutting the legal ties forever between a child and its family. That's a very extreme thing to do. It's why adoption has to be very highly regulated and why we have to be absolutely sure that adoption is the right plan for a child. So that's where I start from. It's thinking about adoption as something that is important and that is necessary to have for a very small percentage of children in our care system. And let's now think a little bit about children, about the children waiting for adoption. I brought with me a magazine, a newspaper that BAF, my organisation, has published for the last 25 years. This is called Be My Parent, and it's a newspaper which contains pictures and profiles of children waiting for adoption. And through this service, we find families for many hundreds of children a year. Now, if you look at the profiles of those children, as I did this morning when I was coming up to this debate, then what you keep reading about are the particular needs of those children. As has already been expressed, these aren't tiny babies without any problems. Often they're older children, children in large sibling groups, children with disabilities. They're children who may have developmental delay. They may have fetal alcohol syndrome. Many of them we know will have lived with parents where family life is characterized by substance misuse, by domestic violence, by parental mental health. If you're going to adopt one of those children, then it's not the same as having your own birth child. And it's absolutely imperative that if you're going to come into the system to be assessed as a prospective adopter, that social workers are absolutely clear and truthful with you about the challenges that these children may bring with them. Okay. Now, one thing that I think is difficult for people to hear is the fact that adoption is a service for children. I think we've heard implicitly already about rights of adults today, but what about the rights of children? Fundamentally, adoption is about finding a family for life for a child, a new family for life, a basic right of a child to have a safe and secure and stable childhood. But it's about trying to find an adopter who can give them that, knowing that, as we do, that about 1 in 5 adoptions disrupt or break down. We know that if you place a child for adoption at an earlier age with minimum delay, that the chances of that adoption are maintaining and lasting are better. That's why focused social work.
John is saying that there is no evidence, so why waste all this time and be horrible to people? Do you know, and it can be anecdotal, I imagine, I can't see why not, but over years and years of your experience, that this screening works? Do you know that this process that you put people through produces better parents, more likely to have successful adoptions? Because I think if there is a huge body of evidence, then I think that shows that John is wrong on this issue. John, I think the big challenge to you from David there was these children are all coming out of the care system, that it's not great to stay in care either, that we should just trust these grown-ups and say they came to this decision and give them the right to adopt. So I think that's quite a few questions till we start. Please don't feel obliged to. And also, this is there will be people in the audience who are here because they're involved in this area. So please, people in the audience, also answer these and give us your views. But first to the panel. Should we go in reverse order, David?
Right. I'm going to answer that question about is this discrimination against the infertile. I don't think it is discrimination. I think it's about being realistic about the task that we're asking people to think about whether that task is right for them. Infertility is tragic and horrendous and awful for people who experience it. But thinking about adoption today, as I've described it, is a whole new set of things to think about. And I think it would be more discriminatory actually to give people no information at all and just pretend that this is exactly the same as having your own child. So I think that we need to be realistic with people about what we're talking about when we talk about adoption. We should talk about all the joys that adoption can bring, but we shouldn't pretend that it's just the same as having your own birth child, because it isn't. And in terms of is there evidence that screening works? Well, let's turn the disruption figures that I quoted on their head. We know that 8 in 10 adoptions don't disrupt. We know that when children are placed early with minimum delay, that there's a greater chance that those adoptions will carry on. We heard Emily talking about the very good statistics in terms of sustainability of inter-country adoption. So I don't think it's a coincidence that those adoptions have worked out. I think it must have an awful lot to do with the fact that the assessment was good, that the matching was good, and that the support is in place.
So we're doing something right.
Yeah.
Terry?
I'd also like to come back on, are we discriminating against the infertile? There's 2 points. One is Interestingly, Dave mentioned the Redbridge case. Redbridge have just brought in a blanket ban on smoking, although there has been an expectation that we will all work in terms of that on the whole. Certainly in the authority I work in, we are not allowed to place children under 3 with smokers, and that's about to change, I think, on BAF's advice, to under 5. However, I would like to say that we can sometimes be flexible on that. But the business about Redbridge is interesting because some years ago, Redbridge were sued by a family who placed 2 children with them, who the family subsequently claimed had completely wrecked their lives and their own family. They also had children of their own, and made a huge, huge claim against Redbridge, primarily on the basis of the fact that Redbridge didn't give them enough information. That has altered the way we work quite considerably, and we are now required to give as much information as we can, certainly in terms of factual information. Prospective adopters, when considering a match, are entitled to have all the medical records and as much other information as possible. They're entitled to be able to discuss things with our medical advisor and generally think about things very carefully. And we would be lapsing in our duty. We have no choice about doing this. This is yet another thing we have to do, and it's right that we do. But Redbridge is interesting. Maybe they have to react very quickly because of past experiences. The other point I'd like to make in relation to this issue is that this, of course, is one of the ironies, if you like, although that's perhaps too light a word. We are placing with people who are infertile precisely those children who have been brought into the world, often with far too little thought. They are from families who are, have had perhaps many children who they are unable to cope with. And this strikes right at the heart of what we're asking adopters to do. These are children from families who have perhaps not thought about the whole task of having children and what it entails, who are unable to meet the children's needs and who have perhaps actively harmed the children for one reason or another. Very often, parents themselves have been through the care system, and they themselves are in need of as much help as they can have. But adopters have to balance this very difficult emotional equation, and the reason we ask them to think about it a lot during the assessment process is because they will be having to cope with the effects of what's happened to these children, what has been done to them for many years. They may also then have to support the children if they want to go and trace their birth parents later. This is a huge emotional ask for these people who cannot have children themselves. And this is why we have to at least try and explore this with them when we are faced with them. But I would just want to take this opportunity to say, myself and other social workers involved in this process are not trying to turn people away. We need adopters. We desperately need adopters. We are wanting to encourage and assess and approve as many people as we possibly can. Because I've got several books like that, like the newspaper David's bought, in my bag, who are full of children, absolutely full, month after month after month, who need families. So the last thing we want to do is turn them away on spurious reasons.
Can I just check what you're waving at me about?
The microphones, if you could just
Move them along, is it?
use them.
Oh, use them. Use the microphones. What a novel idea.
Have they switched on?
Okay, sorry.
That one closer. Too far away. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. John.
I think what I want to say is in answer to all of your, or partially in answer to all of your questions, and of course, since probably David and I are most at loggerheads with one another, some of it's in response to what David said. He said adoption is a service for children. Well, no, it's not. Adoption, I mean, that's a catechism. But in my view, adoption is a service for parents and children. There are two sides to this. David said there is no right to adopt, quite right, but there's no right to be adopted either. These are not enshrined as rights. So to say that there's no right to adopt doesn't really illuminate the discussion. Of course, many adopted children who are placed for adoption have problems, but all children develop, I won't say special needs because that has a special meaning, but all children develop particular and acute needs. Some more than others. All parenting, as I'm sure any parents in this room know, is a very, very difficult activity. And I'm not suggesting, of course, that would-be adopters shouldn't know as much as they can about the children that they're going to adopt. Of course, that's common sense. On the question of whether or not young children or newborns have culture, I think it's clear that they don't. That doesn't mean that they should not be given all the information possible about their origins and their circumstances. But if you say, for example, because Emily produced the example of China to a child that came from China, this is where you came from, this might have been your language. It doesn't follow in any sense that it is their language. There is no sense in which Mandarin is the language of a child that comes from China. What you can say truthfully to that child is, this might have been your language, your mother tongue, had you stayed in China. And if you're curious about this and wish to learn the language that might have been your mother tongue had you stayed in China, then by all means, of course, do so. Children should be given maximum freedom to follow their desires and inclination. That's good parenting. But to say that somehow they are quintessentially Chinese Mandarin speakers, or quintessentially dress in a certain way, or quintessentially should have a particular religion or set of cultural beliefs or practices seems to me to be just absurd. I think that's enough for the time being.
Thank you. Dave?
I suppose my position is slightly different to John's. I'm not arguing there should be no criteria for adoption, and for matching carers with children, for assessing carers. What I'm arguing for is that the criteria that are used at the moment aren't very good ones. They aren't helpful. They don't... the information that they provide don't give you anything that's going to tell you how that individual is going to look after that child. So the cultural arguments don't make sense. The smacking argument is simply, as far as I'm concerned, a particular prejudice about how children should be raised. It's no more right or wrong than the alternative. But I think, as well as this, I think part of what we were trying to do with this session was to actually look at the way in which some of these orthodoxies aren't peculiar to adoption. That's the idea that they're being adopted from outside. So attitudes to smoking, passive smoking, attitudes to the way people parent their children, these are prevalent and in British society in general. And I think, in a way, a lot of this stuff is impacting on the adoption debate anyway. It just so happens that adoption is a particular type of intervention which allows a state to actually impose those kinds of orthodoxies. And the other thing I'd say, which is kind of related to that, is I think it's useful to talk about the criteria that we use when we assess potential adopters, because it kind of keys into this debate about parenting, and I think it's a worthwhile discussion to have. What makes a good parent? What do we mean by family values? No one talks about family values anymore because it's got a certain connotation. But what makes a good family? What makes what? I think those are the kind of discussions which would illuminate, perhaps, what sort of criteria we should be using for assessing carers.
Okay, thank you. Emily?
It's very interesting, the whole question. I mean, I absolutely feel that John has a very good point about anybody, in a sense, being able to sign up for adoption. But I'm also torn, because I know from David that it is important also to be more knowledgeable. I think the problem with the system is it's testing the wrong kind of thing. I mean, what you need at the moment to get through the adoption system is grim determination, quite pushy. It ends up being a lot of middle-class people doing it because, you can argue with officials. You've got more, you just persevere more. You really, really want to be a parent. But I'm not sure that kind of drive, which actually has been my journalistic background has been very useful, necessarily qualified me for when Jade arrived and there I was, with no more great foreign assignments to do, but sitting down, feeling quite daunted by how you look after a baby. So I actually think the filtration process is perhaps sort of looking for the wrong things. I mean, I think perhaps what you need more of in the whole system is more learning, more training about parenting and what it means to parent a child with attachment disorder. I mean, I didn't learn a lot about attachment disorder in my course. There was a lot of questions about our networks and about if Gerald played cricket, didn't that mean it was a male-dominated thing? And wasn't there a gender bias? That's right. Wasn't there a gender bias because Gerald played cricket? And I don't know, there was a lot of questions that didn't actually seem relevant to what I'm dealing with every day now, bringing up my children. So I think I think actually we need to retrain social workers and just look at adoption in a different way. So we're not saying, oh, if you have a history of mild depression, you get turned down, as I found one parent did, or you've got too many books in your house, that family was turned down, or, you know, there are these weird and wonderful Kafkaesque reasons why people get turned down, and a lot of it is simply to do with prejudice. It's not about preparation. If you're in a local authority that doesn't want you to adopt, particularly from abroad, there is a lot of prejudice. They just don't like it. They just think you're a pushy, middle-class white person, and we don't want to let you do it. And some boroughs are great, but some aren't. And I think that's sort of an area where it needs to be a level playing field. It needs to be cleaned up. The other thing is the obligation to culture. I mean, absolutely. I kind of agree with John again. You know, it's true they don't necessarily intrinsically have a culture. I don't think my children are intrinsically good at Mandarin. I mean, actually one is and one isn't. But at the same time, I think it's wrong to deny culture, as happened a lot with Korean adoptees in the States. You know, they'd be adopted in the middle of Texas or somewhere. And from the moment they were brought to America, their country of origin wasn't mentioned. And then these children have grown up very resentful that not a single nod or wink was made towards their origins. So I just think you've got to be open. You've got to, allow children to be as Chinese or not as they want to be. And we just hope that we can offer it to them. If they don't want it, we don't push it down their throats. We don't insist. And just see where it evolves. Let them choose at the end of the day, because they're going to choose their life. So, yeah.
Okay, that's quite enough from our wonderful panel. I love them, but I've heard enough. Oh my God, everyone in the room wants to speak. That's fantastic. I'm going to hear a lot from the audience now. I hope that's okay. We'll let them make their points, say that, and I'll come back to you in 10 minutes or so. I'm going to work from the front backwards. Yes? Fairly brief, because we haven't got that much time.
Very quickly, I'm not going to call you irresponsible, John, but don't you agree that social services have some responsibility to ensure that the people that are placed in their care are able to look after children who, others have pointed out, are not like, you're going to face difficulties that you are unlikely to face with a biological child. Difficulties with food, difficulties with bedtime, because these children have lain in bed, maybe being hit, hungry, scared, so have, very particular difficulties. And I don't know why you get so hung up in the smacking thing. Is it really just devil's advocate? Sorry, I'm turning to Dave, devil's advocate. Isn't it quite sensible to say that a child that most likely has, or most probably has suffered physical abuse, that it's not going to be a very good idea to smack them? But to you, David, I think you say this is the interest of the child. I cannot see how it's in the interest of children who are up for adoption to wait on average 2 years to be adopted. And a lot of it is because people who are going through the process of adoption are, for them, it also takes 1 to 2 years to go through the actual process. There are many more children up for adoption than there are people coming forward for adoption. I have spoken to so many people who have adopted recently, and do you know what they tell me? The most difficult thing was all the hurdles. And the sad thing is, they say, we have 2 or 3 children, one of them, they've ended up adopting children with learning difficulties. They love them to bits, and they would consider adopting more, but they wouldn't go through that intrusive process again. Now, why not just do the 5 days of training which you get? And I think, for a domestic adoption I know in Midlands, you get good training in terms of attachment disorder and all the problems they might have with food and so on. Why not just do the 5 days of training and scrap the home assessment? Because in the Midlands, people wait a year. Yes, you say you haven't got enough people coming forward for adoption. Yeah, they have to wait for a year. And there are children, there are siblings who are waiting to be adopted, so they wait an extra year. That's not in the interest of children.
Can I just say, that was lovely, but it wasn't brief.
Sorry.
Can we have brief contributions? It's very interesting.
In a way from the outside, but looking at this problem of culture and race, I can't think of anything more exciting for a child to know that it has this culture when it finds it out. And there are far too many barriers being placed between cultures, artificial barriers stopping contact. I have grandchildren who are being brought up by my son, who is a humanist and quite like me, and by a Nigerian wife who is a devout Christian. It puts great obligations on me as a humanist when I'm dealing with issues between cultures. It is an education for me as well, and I think it could be a wonderful opportunity to get rid of some of the unnecessary barriers that we have and to provide dialogue. Thank you.
Okay, woman here.
I worked with mentoring programs with youth in foster care, and what I found interesting is when you're matching mentors, it's very easy, and we didn't really match with race, we matched with interests. And the relationships that they built were actually very good relationships and lasting relationships under certain criteria. So my question would be, should we look more at the research that they're getting from mentoring programs? Because I know there's a lot of new mentoring programs at the moment with youth in care. Could we look at the way that they're matching and see, would that be relatable then to adoption? And although a lot of the mentoring are for older children, would there be different criteria that you need for a younger child versus a 5-year-old child versus a 10-year-old child versus a 15-year-old child? So that's just my question.
Okay. There was a woman at the end here, and then gentleman there. I'm working my way back, don't worry.
Hi. I was pleased that David said that adoption is the most radical intervention that the state could ever make. And I do think when we're looking at the debate about adoption, we seem to focus a lot on the interests of the potential adoptive parents or the interests of the child. But obviously, in order for a child to be available for adoption today, it is because they have been taken away from their natural parents. And I would just be interested if we could have a look at that a bit more, and how, if you could just clarify a bit more how difficult it is. And also, I understand there's a 6-month target, I might have got this wrong, that it's only supposed to take 6 months from them going into care to being adopted, which seems a tragedy to me because from my point of view, even though I think people should be able to adopt and the rules are too tight, also it should be really difficult to take the children away from the natural parents.
Gentleman behind you.
Thank you. Just on this question of whether it is arbitrary or wrong to apply criteria for who should be allowed to adopt or who should have IVF, but not apply criteria regarding who should be allowed to have children naturally. John mentioned that it was a charade to suppose that this was applicable, and also Fiona, you mentioned the fact that it was, you said it was discrimination against the infertile. I want to add another point to this, which I think casts doubt on this. I mean, what's really at stake, I take it, and this is obviously debatable, but here's an issue. It's really a principle of non-interference rather than the principle of discrimination. The reason why we have a presumption, not absolute, but a good presumption in favour of letting people who are fertile have their children, is that to do otherwise would be to impose on them, interfere with their lives in a way which is, if not absolutely impermissible, is likely to have very bad consequences socially and for them. Whereas in the case of using criteria for IVF or adoption, well, there are two issues. One, obviously, we can debate what the criteria should be, and no doubt silly criteria can be used by even those with the right to determine those things, like being smug and pushy and middle class and things like that. But whether there should be criteria at all is more difficult, because you can't claim that somebody wanting IVF or to adopt has been interfered with, or at least in any morally impermissible way, if that decision is made. Of course, that doesn't settle the issue, but it's something which brings us back to a kind of theory, a theoretical level, which needs to be addressed.
Thank you. So in the middle here.
Thank you. I have two questions. The first, we've heard a lot about the numbers of children waiting to be adopted. We haven't heard anything about the number of parents waiting to be parents. Do we have, and how long are they waiting? So it'd be nice to have the evidence on that. The other relates to the criteria that we hear. too many books. That sounds like an odd reason, and there's lots of anecdotes about criteria for exclusion. I presume the books must have gone along with a whole lot of other factors, and the parents, the potential parents, must have picked those out. So I would like to hear, what are the criteria that are generally adopted for adoptive parents? Incidentally, I'm quite keen to know more about the smoking story, because I do think it may be wrong for a young child, to be put into a heavy smoking environment. It does damage their health, and there is very good evidence for that. So I wouldn't want to do that.
Oh, I just have to intervene here for 1 second, because I think there's probably lots of anecdotal stuff about the books and all of that. But we have on the table here something that's deeply shocked me, that more local authorities are going to refuse prospective parents children under 5 because they smoke. Both my parents smoked. My sister runs this conference. I'm sitting here chairing, I'm director of the Science Media Centre. I've done quite well. Both my parents smoked. I know loads of parents who are brilliant parents who smoke. I'm very shocked by this. Apparently, you're allowed, in my chair's notes, it says you're allowed to express opinions. I actually, most of what David and Terry have said, I really agree with, and I think there should be criteria and regulation. But I think you need to defend that one. I think parents, fantastic parents, are being put off for something that is a moral value. It's not about how. Richard Dahl, who I'm sure you know as well, Lord Turnberg, said the evidence on passive smoking is very, very small. And anyway, you can ask them to smoke outside and all that. I just think that is terrible. Right. Yes, gentlemen, we're going back. I'm sorry, are the panel happy about this? Yeah, because there's so many people want to say.
Very quickly on the smoking issue, it's funny how love and care can trump culture, but not smoking as a criteria for that. Just to say quickly, I have a massive respect for anyone who does work in the public sector, but especially social workers, because they've so often been the sort of folk devils that have arisen from the moral panics that we've had. And why do I say this? Because actually, whatever criteria we talk about, the people who are interpreting this criteria are the key thing to focus on. They should be well-trained, well-funded, and well-supported. And then we should trust their judgment and allow them to make mistakes, because that, frankly, is an issue of professional judgment, and we should accept that. Quick second point on the identity issue that John Harris raised. Identity is essentially ascriptive in the case of most people, but it should be elective. We should give every chance to choose identity at every opportunity, and perhaps placing across cultures is a very good way of immediately breaking down sort of ascriptive identities, as long as we don't reascribe wrong identities that are then imposed a particular English identity or an English interpretation of a Chinese identity, and so therefore pen further people in. Very quickly, final point. What do the panel think about the idea as adoption as both a signifier of acceptance of alternative lifestyles, such called, and as a vector for further mainstreaming those? In the case of, for example, gay adoption, this would be a very good indicator that British society is coming to terms with the fact that not all people live heteronormative lives.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman there's had his hand up right from the beginning, in the blue. This one first, and then I'll come. Don't worry, I think we're going to get everyone in, so don't worry. Yep.
Just a quick one from me. I hope we don't lose the point about the third parties here. We've heard an awful lot about the children, we've heard an awful lot about the adoptive parents, and we've not really said anything at all about the parents from whom these children are taken. And of course, from the table, we hear that this group of parents are identified as disadvantaged parents. Those are the words that were used. So we have a wider question about disadvantage. And a quick anecdote from me. I'm a community worker who's spent a lot of time working with social workers. And one of my colleagues, he used to fiddle the books to find £20 on a Friday night, and he used to say to mothers, there's a tenner for the babysitter, and there's a tenner for get yourself down the pub. And he told me that was the finest form of child protection he'd ever been involved in. Yeah? So let us not forget about the structural inequalities that make it very difficult for some people to parent the children.
Yep, nice. Yep, gentleman here.
I must say, actually, I've found this one of the most fascinating debates I've ever sat through. But I'm just sort of wondering if what happens is there's a conflation of two different things in the adoption process. The conflation of what makes a good parent, having parenting skills, and having the right political values, which are fads, for example. I mean, even the thing around same-race adoption, that came about from wider political beliefs that the past took on more significance than the present or the future. and filtered through to social policy. But even you see other things like, I believe that racists and homophobes can make good parents. You know, they'll be banned today, but I believe they could. If you think about a generational thing, probably many of our parents, certainly my father, would be classed as racist today and homophobic. He was a fantastic parent. And I think the smoking ones are the absurd ones, but I think we also need to look wider about what makes a good parent and not having the right political values and ideologies today.
Okay, thank you. Woman here, and now everyone's got to be really brief, so I can give the panel plenty of time.
I think Ken did steal my thunder, because I do think that's true, because I'm just horrified as a sort of a natural parent, as it were. You just think, I guess my kids would never be allowed to... I don't have the same interests. My daughter likes karate, I don't like karate. Do you have a fag in the back garden every so often? All these sort of things. So I don't think there should be criteria, and I do think the only judgment probably should be, is someone good and kind, and how do you make that assessment at all? But I can see from Dave's point of view, I guess, is the whole situation about risk, I suppose. I suppose social service saying, well, really isn't it about risk, rather than saying we need to, we've got all these kids that need to be adopted, we've got all these people who want to adopt, and possibly a lack of trust in people.
Okay, yeah, gentleman here.
I suppose I come from the point of view of just gone through this, and I was looking at I went to a meeting where you have potential adopters and people who've got kids, and it was very noticeable when it comes to the training and assessment process. All the ones who hadn't got kids yet were incredibly angry, and all the ones who got kids were just so laid back it was untrue. And it seemed as though the training and the assessment procedure is just there to make adopters angry, potential adopters angry, and serves absolutely no useful purpose. Because the bit where you really want to have a good discussion, which is when you have a particular child that you're looking at, lasts about an hour. And that's the bit where it actually should take a few weeks and have detailed discussion about what the child is, what problems might come up. All that stuff before, it's a complete and utter waste of time. Why do I need to know about fetal alcohol syndrome if the child I'm getting doesn't have it? So and it might make it a bit quicker as well.
Did you want to... Yes?
Yeah, I would sorry, I can't hold on to that back trouble. But, and obviously the discussion of the same race policies has been almost entirely negative this morning, about their iniquities and so on. And although I think there are difficult balances around potential delay, attachment, and indeed sometimes rigidities, I think we should remember why those policies have come into it, and a lot of I would argue, the benefits that have come from them. And I think there's quite impressive research evidence from a number of studies that have shown that issues around ethnic identity and indeed cultural heritage do matter for adopted people a lot. And not everybody, of course, you'll get a lot of variation for individuals, but they matter to such a significant number of people that I think that's been a very valuable product of that. The other crucial aspect here is the impact on the recruitment practices of agencies. We've heard a lot about structural disadvantage, but that also applies to the recruitment of adoptive families, where I think it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that institutionalised racism was a very powerful factor in the 70s and 80s in terms of the criteria that were applied. And undoubtedly, whatever else same-race policies have done, they've helped break through those barriers, and we have many, many more black and minority ethnic adopters today than we would have had in the absence of those policies.
Thank you. Final comment from here, I'm afraid.
I'd just like to really quickly come back on that. I think possibly one of the reasons that so many adopted people feel that their ethnic origins are so important to them, whether or not they're the same as their adopted parents, is kind of the emphasis that we as a society put on genetics and racial background, and that as being part of your identity, rather than what I think actually constitutes your identity, which is your experiences, the people that you've grown up with, your life as you live it. And I think it kind of ties in with what this gentleman was saying about how, as a society, we kind of see the past as being so much more important than the present, the life you're living now, and your future. I think that's probably quite damaging to adopted children.
Thank you so much for those comments from the floor. They were brilliant. Right, I think we'll just go along the row, if that's all right, David. And please don't try and answer everything. Just pick up your one or two most important points.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to start by saying Somebody talked about delay for children, and I agree, delay is the most corrosive thing for a child. If adoption is the plan for a child, then we need to work really, really hard to help that child achieve that plan. It's tragic that there are children waiting for adoption who appear in newspapers like Be My Parent, the one I showed you before, and they are in there month after month because we're struggling to find families for those children. But often, the reason that there's delay, it's not about political correctness, it's about the fact that it's very hard to find a family for 4 children, for 4 siblings. Or it's difficult to find a family for a child with complex disabilities. And that's why when we think about recruiting adopters, we really need to recruit people who positively want to adopt children who may bring some difficulties with them. I also wanted to just make a quick comment about the person who said that the training and assessment process made people angry. It shouldn't make people angry. It should be an opportunity to explore all of the things that you're going to have to think about when a new child comes into your family. It's about exploring why you really want to adopt, what the motivation is, how you'd cope with different situations. If you haven't got children, it's trying to imagine what your parenting style would be like. It's meant to be helping people, not making them angry. If it's making them angry, then the process needs to get better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Emily?
Yes, I think the process does need to get better. That would be my main point. I think the reason for a lot of the anger is this sense of power imbalance. And I think people who have had trouble having biological children sort of feel angry about that. And then they suddenly come up against this huge mountain of bureaucracy. And it's almost as if the bureaucracy is kind of beating them over the head for something that wasn't their fault in the first place. One of the phrases that our social workers used was, "We must make sure you've properly grieved your infertility." Well, I have to say, I don't think you ever completely get over it. I mean, I still, I admit it. It would be lovely if I had a biological child. I'm sorry, I still grieve my infertility, but I still have 2 absolutely adorable, wonderful children, and I would never have not adopted them. So I think we just need to have a more sensible approach and reform, please.
Terry?
Where can I begin? First of all,
Sorry.
The gentleman at the back who talked about the birth families of these children, the structural inequality, because clearly in dealing with families who do have to have this ultimate intervention of having their children removed, we are dealing with families at the very sharp end, that one end of the spectrum. They're right at it. I think all social workers who I've ever come across who work with these families, trying to keep the children there, it is heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. The concept of free will is nowhere for many of these parents because they have come themselves to a very large extent from care backgrounds, with parents who have been absent or who have had significant mental illnesses or in other ways are very dysfunctional. They also come from very unsupported families. All of that is, there isn't much worse that you can do. There are no words worse to say to parents, "I'm sorry, that's it. I'm going to take your children away." You just can't do that lightly. You don't do it as a social worker on the front line. I've had to say those words several times to families. And, in terms of what you have to say to people in different times of their life, it's never, ever as bad as that. And it is dreadful because whatever they've been into, whatever has happened, even people who actively abuse children, do love them in some ways, have tried sometimes, have to a certain extent somewhere done their best, but they just haven't got it. And that is a hard, hard thing to say to anybody. And I agree, poverty is the largest contributor to that. When I set out to be a social worker, I thought that I would be working myself out of a job within 10, 15 years. Now, that was naive, and the discussion with Ken yesterday, it's an ongoing thing, but that's where we're at. That's what we have to do, because children cannot wait to be parented. That's the heart of it. If you leave them in my view, they're already left far, far too long. If you leave them, things will get worse. Now, just to the second, and anyway, we have no choice. You know, they need protection. Les mentioned the business of the assessment criteria. We have to do what we call the statutory checks. We have to do the CRB checks. We have to take up and visit personal referees. If they work with children, I think this is outrageous, but, well, we have to get an employer's reference, which I think is completely intrusive and wrong. We have to provide a certain amount of training. I agree with David that training should be informative, enjoyable, should start to build the bonds with other adopters where you can call on them for support later. The important bit, in my view, is the home study, where we try and get to know people. We try and get to know them. We usually say to people who come on our courses, this is about horses for courses. It's about enabling us to know whether you are, you know, a quiet person or an outgoing person. I know if you brought round a football team full of 7-year-olds, you know, I'd blink, sit down, but I could cope with it. If you brought me round a child who was very, very quiet and introverted, I'd be hopeless, absolutely hopeless. Now, we need to know about those sorts of things so that, you know, it helps us in the matching. Just briefly, Les said about the numbers of people waiting. Actually, that would be quite a difficult statistic to get. It's difficult data to get because some people, once they're approved, are matched almost immediately, and some people wait for ages. It's partly to do with the sort of children, the age, sex, what the difficulties they can cope with. But it's difficult information to get. But you've raised a good point, and maybe we should think about, I don't know, perhaps, David, we've already got that. I don't know, but it seems to me difficult to get.
Maybe not. Maybe we'll discuss it later. Sorry, I know we're over time already, so... Dave.
Oh, me, sorry. It just occurred to me that I understand in the United States, it's actually against the law for the adoption authorities to use race or culture as a criteria for assessing adoptive carers. So I think it's worth just keeping that in mind. This isn't set in stone. This is a particular policy approach that's been adopted in the UK. With regards smacking and smoking again, I wasn't saying that this may not be an issue in certain circumstances. It may be, as you suggested, that where there's been physical abuse of a particular child, that you would be choosing a carer who's got a certain approach, which isn't going to be smacking that child. And again, with smoking, like it's already been said, but that, you know, the evidence on passive smoking isn't particularly strong. There may be arguments with particularly young children, perhaps, but again, I don't think the science is necessarily supportive of that. Somebody mentioned interference as the key issue when it comes to the adoption process. I think it's interesting. I try to put it in context by saying that adoption is a small part of a bigger picture, and there are actually fewer children taken into the care system than ever. But at the same time, there is a lot of interference across the board, and more so than before. So there's fewer children taken into care, but there's more children who have more intervention in their families. There's a lot of family support intervention. There's a lot of, I think it's part of our culture generally, you know, Sure Start, children's centres. There's an expectation that families can't cope. So there's a lot of interference in families across the board. And finally, birth parents. I didn't want to address this as part of the session because it's a debate of its own, effectively. But I think it's worth mentioning that, on the one hand, we should be trusting social workers to some extent. You know, their professionalism is very important, and we need to recognise that. But as David said, it is a radical intervention to take some of these children from them. And I think it's worth thinking about the fact that family courts, where these decisions are made, are closed. It's not possible to actually have a debate openly about these kinds of issues because family courts just don't allow that to happen. So, you know, I'll leave it there.
3 very quick points. First, I just want to take up David's point at the beginning. 8 in 10 adoption placements don't disrupt. That's success. Well, we don't know. There are no controls. I think the interesting question will be what proportion of children placed by sexual reproduction with their genetic parents fail. And I bet I bet it isn't as high as 8 out of 10. So that's the proper comparator, it seems to me. Second point, first question we got, don't I agree that society has some responsibility for the safe placement of children? Absolutely I do. And we have that responsibility also for children who result from sexual reproduction, and we don't discharge it. And there are very good reasons why we don't discharge it, and I just think it's playing games at the margin to make a meal of that responsibility in terms of adoption and assisted reproduction. And of course, all would-be parents should have information about what their children are likely to need, and most parents do get that information, whether they are pregnant as a result of sexual reproduction or whether they would be adopted. I'm not, of course, suggesting that they shouldn't have, that everybody doesn't need lots and lots of information. A final point, I think she's gone, the last, I think, questioner who talked about race and the issue about race and culture mattering. I think they matter because people have been taught that they ought to matter. And the same is true of genetics. And the sooner we get rid of the genetic essentialism and indeed cultural and racial essentialism, the better the world will be. And finally, I must take a little dig at Les Turnberg about smoking. I agree with you, and so we shouldn't allow the Chinese or the Italians, for example, either to have children or to adopt them, because smoking is far too high in both those countries.